I'd like to begin our discussion today talking about loneliness. And sometimes we don't really know what loneliness is. We have sometimes a picture of, let's say, an elderly person alone and isolated in a retirement home. But sometimes loneliness can look like this picture here. These are people in Times Square in New York City. And although there's probably millions of people, we know there's around 7 million people in New York City itself, and in Times Square, tons and tons of people. Even though you could be in a place like this, you could still feel lonely. So it's kind of strange how this could happen with all these many people around you. You still feel isolated. So loneliness then is kind of a state of being where you don't have reciprocity. You could, for example, be in a hospital, and although there are nurses that are coming in to check on you regularly, they're helping you, but because you can't help them, you could still feel lonely. And if you tried to help them as the patient, you could be stopped. Say, no, 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 we're taking care of this. And so you can't really give. And so then you could feel lonely in that situation. And then we even have now social media, which has, kind of helped to curb loneliness, but in many aspects to create other aspects of loneliness. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. But you could have, so many friends on Facebook, but yet you still feel lonely. So perhaps we could just say that to not be lonely, you need to be in direct exchange, direct contact with people. In fact, since we're on the topic of social media, sometimes, we'll just click like on something and feel like that is making a connection, but actually it's not. You want to be more actively engaged, and actually a direct message is now a feeling of closeness. Or writing a comment as opposed to just liking something is also a way to engage further and to avoid feeling lonely, because social media also has that effect that it can create loneliness. So, and these are proven, these techniques have been studied in a recent survey, found that that's one way to make it better. Now, I want to just give a little background before I start going further into these strategies. When we look at our evolutionary past of human beings from thousands of years ago, we see that human beings existed in tribes and communities. And that, in fact, the tribes and the communities of times past ensured the survival of people. Within that community, you had your social contacts, you had your food, your security. Communal life meant that you're not an individual, you are a part of this collective. And if the collective is doing well, the individual is doing well, because together they could fend off predators. Together they could collect enough food for days that would allow for greater survival. But just imagine that if you were somehow detached from your group, let's say in the savannas of Africa, and now you were forced to wander alone because you've been displaced from the group, how long do you think you'd be able to survive? Not very long. All alone in the wilderness. So we human beings are actually, you know, very, very, very tribal and community oriented, and thanks to that we can survive. So this kind of work has been introduced by a neuroscientist by the name of, I believe his name is John Cacioppo, and I recommend that you read his work. It's very, very inspiring, and he talks a lot about this. And one of the things that a study that he made, he's been doing this research for many years, and there's one interesting study that he did where he put lonely people. He gathered these different subjects, people who were lonely, people who had more social connections, and he put some sort of scan into the brain. And he found that when there was looming danger, something seeming like dangerous coming up, the people who were lonely could detect the danger in about 150 milliseconds, while it took those who had more social connections twice as long to pick up the threat, 300 milliseconds. So what does that say? It says that those people who are lonely, they are more alert and feel more vulnerable to looming danger. And they have a feeling of more self-protection. And they're more reading the cues of danger. They surmise because they feel actually so alone and vulnerable. So, it's no surprise that we find people who are lonely to take less risks. People who are lonely to be more frightful of the world. And after time, if that becomes a habit, a worldview for you, then you become more and more isolated. And then people also start to shun you because they can't understand why you're so, quote unquote, negative or something like that. So there's been other scientific studies that show that one of the things that leads to a prolonged life, that leads to long life, is actually having social connections. That people who are lonely have a 50% more chance of dying early. My mother often wonders why my grandparents lived so long. She said, because, they had better food those days, cleaner food, environment was cleaner, and everything plays a factor. But definitely my grandparents were blessed with a family that always took care of them, that kept them in their home, that gave them everything they needed, included them in every aspect of life. And so it's no surprise to me that that's why they lived a long time into their 90s. Now, so I want to talk to you also about another study. There was an interesting study that was done, I think about 7 years ago, something like that. I think it was Mays Tamil and Iris Moss who conducted this study. And they wanted to see if human beings had the capacity to make themselves happier. So they conducted their study in Japan, I think Thailand, Russia, and the United States. And they found that out of all those countries, yes, human beings could in fact make themselves happier in all places except for the United States. And so this is the kind of stuff that they would ask people in the study. They would show, for example, they would show them a picture of a man or a person in front of a crowd of people. And they would ask the participants to describe the picture. And they found that, in the United States, when people saw those pictures, people described with more emphasis the individual that was standing in front of the crowd. So they, giving more details about the individual, what he or she is doing, how they're feeling, etc. But in these other countries, in Japan, in Russia, in Thailand, people first started by describing the crowd and what's happening in the crowd. And then at the end, getting around to the individual. They also did the study with children in these countries. And they would show children a picture of a little girl surrounded by other children. And the little girl was doing well. Well, she had a big smile on her face, and the other children were suffering. And they asked the children to decide, is this little girl happy? And in the United States, all the children said, yes, the little girl is happy. But in the other countries, they said, no. Basically, how could the little girl be happy if the other children around her are not happy? So clearly, there is a more emphasis on the collective in Russia, Japan, Thailand. And in the United States, there's more emphasis on the individual. And so human beings in the United States try to make themselves happier by making themselves happier, by focusing on themselves. And it's a big part of our, of the way we talk about loneliness and helping a person. We tell people things like, only you can change yourself. Only you have the power to change yourself. We have, even concepts that I use that we throw out that say self-care. You need some me time. Today I need to have some me time. And sometimes we when we need help, we go to a friend and we talk about our problems. But the research shows that this approach does not make us happier. The difference is that in these other countries, people are concerned more with the collective. And so they are more likely to find happiness if they feel like they are a part of a collective that is doing well. And so they contribute to the collective, knowing that that is going to contribute to their own personal happiness. So it's kind of two different approaches to well-being. But here in the United States, we have it wrong. The studies are showing that that doesn't help us. So what should we do instead when we're feeling depressed, when we're feeling down? We should actually try to help somebody else. It doesn't matter how much pain we're in. We could still find a little space in our mind and in our time to do something to help another person, and then see how you feel. I think it would be a good study, a good personal study for oneself. The next time that you're feeling lonely and you're feeling depressed, if you could do an experiment. Today, I'm going to focus on myself and pamper myself and give myself everything I need and want. Of course, you need to have your needs met. Don't get me wrong. And then the next day, try focusing on others and going out of your way to helping others. Go for a walk in a big city and see if you can help somebody that needs help. I'm sure you'll find lots of people that do. And then at the end of the day, make a note and then see it. Which one makes you happier more at the end of the day? How do you feel at the end of the day? So, what I'm trying to also say is that, in another point that's important to be made right now is that loneliness is actually a causal factor of depression. People think that when you're depressed, you get lonely. But actually, other studies have shown that loneliness is what leads to depression. And so it's something that we have to be very concerned with, because we had a loneliness epidemic, in the last few years. to the point where the British government now has a department of loneliness and actively takes measures to help people who are in these situations. We even worried that 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 during COVID, because we had a loneliness epidemic, that COVID, because of the social distancing, would make that worse. But actually, the opposite has happened, and there's new studies now that are coming out that shows that it was even the wrong approach to say social distancing. We should have been saying physical distancing, because actually people began to socialize more during COVID, precisely because we were deprived of it. We couldn't see each other physically. So then we started using the internet, like even our own online meditations. We went from this one happening on Saturdays to a few going on now throughout the week that we're still doing, providing more opportunities for people to socialize and connect. So social distancing should have just meant to keep socializing, but distantly. So fortunately, some of that has leveled off, actually, but still, the fact remains that a lot of times too, we are lonely because we're using the wrong approach to make ourselves feel better. And this is more the subject of another discussion we'll have here. Is we have a lot of individualistic tendencies. Like I need to, everything I do is for myself. Everything I do is for myself. Like, I make sure I have, I get my degrees for myself. I set up my status for myself. I build up my ego. I buy a lot of nice things. I have a nice home. I make sure I appear well. I post really nice pictures of myself on Instagram, on Facebook. And so we seem to think that if we set up the conditions to make ourselves feel good, but actually those things don't lead to happiness. Other studies have shown, and we'll do another talk on that. Right now, what I'm mainly trying to say is that we forget that actually we have a better chance of finding lasting happiness and not feeling lonely when we focus on the collective. Okay? And I want to give you some examples of that. There is there's a community of people called the Hutterites. The Hutterites are kind of like, they're very similar to the Amish people, very similar to the Mennonite people. They're a very closed off community that lives in rural areas. And but one of the things that they have, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Amish in a moment, is they have very, very strong communal ties. Very, very strong communal ties. And scientists, there was a study that was done on associating loneliness with sleep fragmentation. So it turns out that lonely people, their sleep is more fragmented at night. They have a tendency to wake up more in the middle of the night, even for small moments, and then go back to sleep. And the scientists have connected that to our evolutionary past. If you were alone, let's say in ancient times in the savannah of Africa, wandering around, then yes, it's very likely you would not sleep through the night because you wake up fearing a predator, fearing an animal, fearing some sort of condition that makes you vulnerable. And so that comes at play now, even today when we are lonely. Our sleep is fragmented. And they wanted to test how strong these communal ties were in the Hutterite community. And so they did this, they wanted to measure their sleeping. And they found that they had almost zero sleep fragmentation in those communities, which is amazing. And they correlated that with their strong sense of community and not feeling loneliness. So I want to talk to you a little bit more, and then we'll bring in people for the discussion. You can start to type in your comments. The Amish people, when we have our retreats in Port Royal, Pennsylvania, at a beautiful Hare Krishna farm called Gita Nagari. The Hare Krishnas are great. They cook such nice food, and they're very nice folks. But on the way to our retreats, now we always see an Amish community that lives nearby, and the road has a sign with a picture of a buggy. Watch out for the buggies, and we always get to wave at the Amish. And when you look at them, it's very easy to judge them, right? I have a picture of the Amish. It's very easy to say, wow, look at those people. They are so backwards. They live literally like it's the 1800s. They really do. That's when their community settled from Germany. And they have their own school system. They don't use any electricity. They use very minimal new advances. And it's easy to just kind of discard them as saying that these people are highly backwards. What's wrong with them? But one of the important things to recognize about the Amish is that they make a choice to live like that. In fact, when you turn 16 years old, if you are born into an Amish family, they send you off on something called Rumspringa. And Rumspringa is a period where they go off for about a couple of years into the world, and they're supposed to go crazy. They're supposed to go and drink and party and do whatever they want. Do you name it, they should, they'll do it. The families kind of make this sacrifice. They send their children off so that then afterward, they have to make a choice. Do you want to come back and be a part of the religion? Be a part of the community? Because they're a fundamentalist Christian religion as well. Or do you want to stay in the world? And 80% of them come back. 80%. So then it's not fair to say that the Amish are some sort of insane cult of people set on their ways. They let people choose that lifestyle. And for whatever reason, if 80% are coming back and people stay in their communities for a lifetime, there's a very strong sense of security. And in fact, there are many signs of how communal they are. They don't, for example, have church at a church. They have church in their homes, and every week the community takes turns visiting another family to have service. So, studies were done on the Amish, much like the Hutterites, showing how much happier they are. They don't experience loneliness, even without all of the commodities. Even without all of the commodities. They don't live far away from each other. They live close to each other. Think of all your friends. Where are your friends? My friends are all over the place. They live some are in Philadelphia, some are in all over the place. But the Amish, their friends are up the street because they live within these small communities. They don't have cars, right? They should. We have airplanes. So we can get, we have to make a big effort to meet people, we have to go through rush hour and to connect. And so the point is that these communities, thriving communities, they have less incidences of depression, less incidences of loneliness. Now we have to qualify this in the following way. The Amish are not perfect. In fact, they are very patriarchal, and they don't accept homosexuality. So they are very much traditionalist in that regard too, and people suffer. There could be, domestic abuse, and women have no voice, don't have too much access to communal support in order to, against that kind of thing, because of the patriarchy and the culture. So They are not perfect in that regard. And that's why it is important that now, as we begin to talk about strategies, yes, I am encouraging you to find a strong community and also look to our community for support as well. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But communities sometimes can also have a downside, and I like to look at all sides of things. Sometimes, yes, in the past we had our communal tribes where we were together, but also that led to a lot of geosentiment, socio-sentiment, all types of groupisms, and a lot of times these tribes were at war with each other. And a lot of times these groups, these kingdoms, like in Sanskrit, there's the word Gotras. The Gotras were led by a rishi or some sort of patriarch after matrilineal societies. In the beginning, human beings were matriarchal, matrilineal societies. Then eventually they turned into patriarchal societies. But in these communities, you had war and groupisms. And so although it's great to be a part of a group, of course, we all know the downsides of that. When the group's agenda is not in the best interest of the individual and is only in the interest of their own agenda. So we want to be careful of that. And so then one thing to say to that then is that when we form parts of communities, yes, we need to relish in that and value that. At the same time, we always need to keep in mind a universalist perspective. And it's very possible to be a part of multiple communities. For example, myself, I'm in Vistara Circle. We are a community. And I also have community with my family. I have community at work with my colleagues. And I try to the best of my ability to be open to all of those communities. I try to the best of my ability to never feel like my community is better than any other community. And if somebody approaches me on the street who is a stranger, I don't turn away from them. I don't say, I don't know you, you're not in my community, I won't speak to you. Everywhere and at any time, we should have that universalist perspective that every human being is my tribe. That is important. At the same time, it is also very good to solidify our communities and do what we can to make those strong and thriving. Okay? Now what John Kennedy said in the 1960s makes sense. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So in other words, but no. It should be ask not what the world can do for you, but what you can do for the world, because we should think beyond geosentiment and also think beyond group sentiment. But in our groups and in the world, yes, we should be doing more for the community, doing more for each other. That is going to make us less lonely, less depressed, and happier. Okay? It's an important takeaway that I hope that you'll gain from our chat. And then I'll close now and we'll continue the discussion by offering you also another perspective. We are spiritualists, right? That's why we have this universalist approach. But one thing we have to remember is that even though human beings need, and there's a beautiful quote by Johann Hari, and we are going through a series on the topics in this book, the book Lost Connections by Johann Hari. So he says in that book, human beings need a tribe like bees need a hive. A bee cannot survive alone. A bee has to return to a hive, to a community. Same thing with people. As you saw the statistics, you have a 50% more chance of dying earlier if you do not have social connections. So even though we are wired in this way, and the Supreme chose for us to be like this, communal, we should always remember that we are never alone. No matter what, we are never alone. And my guru has a beautiful quote. He said, you are never alone or helpless. The force that guides the stars guides you too. So remember that if you should ever feel disconnected from the community, disconnected from people who are very important to you, that you are not alone. The force that guides the stars is with you and is guiding you as well. So the very last thing before I'd like to hear your comments is that, here at Vistara Circle, we are a community, okay? But we are an online community, so we have limitations. So that's why it's very important that we have, for example, our Vistara Circle socials for official member, where we just kind of have a Zoom call and we chat. That's important for that reason, to have more FaceTime. Elderly people who use the internet to connect with their relatives, those who don't use video chat are more lonely than those who do. So things like video chat has really helped, and it's also important for our community that we meet at retreats. Once we're able to, after COVID, so that we actually make these real physical connections, even though we're not physically together. We see each other online, but there are opportunities to see each other, like at retreats, okay? And also in different Zoom calls. So just keeping that in mind. Now, let's go ahead and hear from you all. We'll take a few comments and then we will start to close. Let's see here. Doug says, physical distancing instead of social distancing. Yes, that's much better, right? Because we need to be socially connected. That's the point. Do not socially cut yourself off. I know people who do that. I know people who, if you have a party at your house, they want to stay in their room. They don't want to see people. They don't like it when guests come over. It's not good to be like that. We have to open our hearts. We have to get out of our shells. We have to be open to the experience of other people, because our survival depends on it. Our mental well-being depends on it. Karen says, deeply appreciate this opportunity to thrive in this tribe here and to share this with others. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. You make this. Everybody here makes this.